the point where academic gaps become obvious. The moment everything starts to feel slightly harder. There's a point where learning doesn't feel smooth anymore. Not completely confusing, not impossible, just heavier than it used to feel. You're sitting in class or working through something, and suddenly it takes more effort to follow along. You can still keep up, but it feels like you're thinking harder than before just to understand. At first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. You assume it's just the topic getting harder. But when you think about it, that feeling doesn't always come from the new material itself. Why does it feel like a gap at the beginning? At the start, nothing feels missing. You're answering questions, completing assignments, moving forward with everyone else. If something is slightly unclear, you tell yourself it will make sense later, and sometimes it does. But sometimes it doesn't. This raises a question. How many things do we move past without fully understanding? How small missed pieces stay hidden? A gap doesn't always show up as failure. It shows up as slight hesitation, slower thinking, needing more time than expected. You still get the answer, but the process feels less clear. You just keep going. A situation that feels familiar without being obvious. I've noticed this during lessons where everything builds on previous topics. But inside, you're trying to connect it to something you're not fully confident about. You don't ask because you're not completely lost. You're just slightly unsure. And that slightly unsure feeling repeats more often than you realize. When effort starts increasing without clear progress, at some point you begin putting in more effort. You review notes, spend more time studying, try to catch up on what feels unclear. But the results don't always match the effort. You're working harder, but not necessarily understanding more. This is interesting because it looks like effort should solve the problem, but something else is missing. The difference between recognition and understanding. One of the clear signs of a gap is when something feels familiar but not usable. You recognize a concept, a formula, or a term. You've seen it before. But when you try to apply it, it doesn't come together. It's like knowing what something looks like without knowing how it works. That difference doesn't feel obvious until you need to rely on it. Why gaps become visible at certain points. They become visible when the level of thinking changes. When you move from following steps to solving problems independently. When questions are no longer predictable. This raises another question. If understanding only shows under pressure, how much do we actually understand before that point? The role of independent work. Independent work is usually where everything becomes clear. Without examples, without guidance, without someone showing the steps, you rely on your own understanding. And if something is missing, it shows immediately. Not dramatically, but enough to slow you down. The part that feels frustrating but hard to explain. There's a specific kind of frustration that comes with this. You know you've learned the material. You've seen it, practiced it, maybe even done well on earlier tasks. So why does it suddenly feel unclear? That confusion doesn't come from lack of effort. It comes from something deeper not being fully built. Why it's easy to misidentify the problem. It's easy to blame the current topic. But when you look closer, the difficulty often connects to something earlier. A concept you didn't fully understand. A step you memorized but didn't internalize. The gap didn't start here. It just became visible here. The moment you start looking back instead of forward, there's usually a shift where you realize pushing forward isn't helping. You stop trying to keep up and start trying to understand. That often means going back, reviewing something you thought you already learned. And that can feel uncomfortable, especially when everyone else is moving ahead. Why this moment matters more than it seems. This is the point where most people either fix the gap or carry it forward. If you address it, learning becomes clearer again. If you ignore it, it follows you into the next topic, and then the next. That's how small gaps turn into larger ones. The difference between covering material and building understanding. Covering material is about moving through topics. Understanding is about building connections between them. You can move through something quickly without building those connections. But eventually, those connections are required. That's when the gap becomes obvious. A subtle realization that changes how you learn. There's a moment where you realize that understanding is not about how much you've seen, but how clearly you can use it. That changes how you approach learning. You start paying attention to what feels slightly unclear instead of ignoring it. Final thoughts. Academic gaps don't appear suddenly. They build quietly and reveal themselves when the level of thinking increases. The moment they become obvious is not the beginning of the problem. It's the moment you can finally see it. And once you see it, you have a choice. Ignore it and move forward, or slow down and actually understand. That choice is what shapes everything that comes after. Thanks for watching.